Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on effective enterprise risk management and compliance, a practical solution. My name is David Griffiths. I'm a Managing Director of CompliSpace, and I'll be taking you through the presentation this afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us. Can I start by just covering off on a couple of housekeeping issues before we get into it? You will see on the control panel on your screen that you are able to ask questions during the course of this webinar. Please do feel free to ask questions in there. I will endeavour to, I will have a staff member moderating those questions, and will endeavour to answer some of them during the course of the presentation. If not, we will cover off on those and send out a separate email to you all after this in the next couple of days to cover off on those particular questions. We will be recording this webinar, and we will make it available within the next 5 or so days to everyone, so do feel free to review it again or to circulate it to the link to a staff member when you receive that by email. Just before we get going, a bit of background on CompliSpace. CompliSpace is a consulting organisation that specialises in providing governance, risk and compliance programs and services. We operate across a wide range of industries across Australia, including financial services for ASX listed companies, private companies and not-for-profit organisations of various types and sizes. At the heart of what we do as an organisation is the belief that in order for governance, enterprise risk and compliance to really work in practice at an organisational level, we believe that organisations, whether they be companies, businesses, schools, not-for-profit charities, etc., that they must embrace technology in order to bring it to life. To do this, our focus really is on delivering specialist knowledge through technology-driven systems and solutions that are designed to create optimal commercial outcomes for our clients. And a big part of this presentation this afternoon will be to show you a demonstration of one such solution that we provide to bring governance, risk and compliance to life in organisations. Okay, quick overview on what we'll be covering off over the course of the next hour. The focus, I guess, the entry point to talk about enterprise risk and compliance coming to life in companies is to focus very much on enterprise risk in the first instance. That is, in general terms, the more complex of those two disciplines, and then to show where compliance fits within that framework, and then to show how the two come to life in a practical example. So we're going to cover off on what risk management is. We're going to talk about why it's important for organisations. We essentially bind everything to relevant standards, or build our systems and solutions on relevant standards where applicable. So I'll take you through the ISO 31000 risk management standard. We'll talk about compliance in particular, and the relationship between risk and compliance, and in particular the 3806 standard on compliance ever so briefly. We'll then get to the crux of the presentation, which is how you integrate that within your organisation to bring it to life, and show you a practical demonstration of how that can work within your organisation through the use of technology and the like. So without further ado, straight into the presentation. We'll start with some definitions. Look, the ISO 31000 definition of risk management talks about the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, in our experience with the many companies that we consult with around this, we find that a relatively vague definition. So we essentially built our own definition out. And here it is. It's that risk management is a structured process which assists organisations to predict future events which may impact on their activities, and allows them to take appropriate actions to address the likelihood of the event occurring and the impact should it occur. All pretty straightforward and simple stuff, but some of the key words in there are, firstly, that it's a structured process, that it enables, that it deals with the future, that it deals with both positive and potentially negative impacts on activities. And then we get into the dealing with the likelihood of an event occurring and the potential consequences if that event should occur. It's pretty simple, really. I mean, here's a simple analogy on risk management. It's something that we practice every day and have been practicing since Joseph played fullback for Jerusalem. The reality is that if you take the analogy of purchasing a car, you're going to make a simple assessment of the type of car that you need, depending on whether or not you're wanting to do laps around the racetrack or drive or buy the family planner for your car, for your family. You'll assess the safety of the vehicle depending on what your purpose of use is and your risk profile. You'll then go out and insure the vehicle as well. Standard risk management processes. The reality is for our organisations that risks come in different sizes and shapes depending on the nature of our organisation. If we take a school, for example, we have the very realistic risk of injury occurring in the playground or on the sporting field. Now, that is something that in terms of likelihood on an annual basis you would have to say is 100% that injuries will occur. It's absolutely likely and that an injury will occur. So we move straight on to dealing with the potential consequences of that particular risk. For many organisations, the threat of natural and other industrial disasters leads us to thinking about business continuity and the like. We talk about risk in terms of disaster recovery from a technology perspective. We also talk about the risk of bullying in the workplace and bullying in the playground. It doesn't matter the nature of the organisation where you bring people into the one environment. The threat of bullying, harassment and so forth is a very real risk and has been for a long time. We also talk about those risks of fraud and they're probably some of the more substantial corporate risks that we see, particularly around the accounting space and some of the accounting risk management issues. We have risks that relate to our staff in particular, whether they be teachers or as in a school example or not-for-profit or even ASX company, what our employees might get up to outside work as well is a big reputational risk for our organisations. And then we have that typical one of compliance risk in a company, which is something that affects us all irrespective of the nature of the organisation. And that is the risk that we will not comply with relevant regulatory or legislative obligations that we have as a company. Now, what enterprise risk management does is it brings all of those risks together and the many more under a single structured discipline. And I suppose one of the aspects to think about when talking about risk management, as I often, when talking about enterprise risk management, say, look, it really is just management with a four-letter word in front of it, except that four-letter word requires us to follow a structured methodology. And really what it comes down to is risk management therefore becomes simply good management principles that really we tend to, once they're put in place, accept that that they are no-brainers. They are things that a good management structure within an organisation should follow. So why is risk management important for organisations? Well, let's look at the very basics of this to start with. And these are some of the intuitive issues that come up. First one is that risk protects our assets. As simple as that. Having effective risk management, an effective risk management program in our organisation helps us to protect the value in our organisation. That's a no-brainer. That's the one that anyone will say as soon as you ask them why we do risk management. Now, in order to protect once we've protected our assets, it enables us to start to leverage those assets. And it's at that point that we get into the real crux of the benefits of risk management when done properly. And that's all about increasing productivity, increasing output, and enabling an organisation to achieve its strategic objectives. Now, whether those objectives are in the pursuit of profit for a commercial enterprise or whether they're for, say, a charity for the pursuit of providing a better world to the stakeholders that the charity supports. It doesn't really matter. this is about increasing productivity and about enabling us to achieve those objectives with the use of the assets that we have in play. Now, organisations have many different stakeholders, and this is one of the key issues of risk management, is that from that perspective, an organisation must contemplate the many different stakeholders around that the organisation has varying amounts of influence on, and those stakeholders that influence the organisation, from its staff and shareholders through to the families of its staff and shareholders, through to the corporate regulators or the various regulators. And I note on that one that, you know, we're extremely heavily regulated in Australia, with multiple regulators that have influence and control over all of our businesses. So that's a critical stakeholder in any business, is the regulatory overseer of your business, through to now the media. And whether you're a private company, a public company, a not-for-profit, it doesn't really matter. You have some exposure to this, certainly at varying degrees, and that's the mainstream media. We also have to take into account social media, and the contributors to that might come from our staff, our shareholders, our suppliers, our customers, or the public at large. But we have to be able to contemplate that now as part of our risk management strategy. Through to our customers, our suppliers as well, and all the way over to the general public, or our fans, or our sponsors, whatever other community-based stakeholders there might be around our organisations. The key message there is that in this day and age, with the immediacy of information, with the high community expectations and standards that are set upon our organisations, we have many, many stakeholders, and we need to be able to contemplate our interaction with each when we're building out our risk management program. And all of that before we even start actually doing our work. One of the really the most important things when thinking about risk is it's a concept that we build structure and put programs and undertake activities today that really are focused on the future. Risk is all about quantifying future uncertainty and taking actions today to help us achieve our objectives going into the future. But one of the other key things is that for many organisations, it's not just about what happens today. It's also about dealing with what has happened in the past. And in a commercial context, there are many, many examples of that. If we take something like James Hardie with asbestos and things like that, having to deal with that in a commercial context today in order to manage its risk going forward in the future and its liabilities on that basis. In a not-for-profit context, we have exactly the same sorts of issues that come up. If we take a school as an example, a typical example there is that schools will often, or we see in the press, that schools will from time to time have to deal with poor behaviour or infringements that have occurred a long time in the past, long before the current management team has taken over. That affect them today and may affect their brand and reputation in the future. Very similar for charities, very similar for private organisations. So one of the key things that dealing with risk management does, and one of the key important aspects, is reputation. And reputation is, look, it's something that does take a long time to build and can be destroyed in an instant. There's an ongoing debate in risk management as to whether or not reputation should be considered a risk or an outcome. In my view, it doesn't really matter. What we all need to understand is that reputation is something that cuts through all different risks in our organisation, and we need to contemplate that as a critical aspect of our risk management program, so that we can manage that reputation should something occur that potentially damages that in the future. So what is the risk of failing to manage risk? Now, this is a slide that I've been trying to update for a number of years now, but I keep coming back to it. The blue line in the centre, or the blue shape in the centre, is essentially the yellow shape here under the blue is essentially the good ship governance. There's your organisation sitting in the good ship over the sea. the one thing that is essentially protecting your organisation is governance, risk and compliance infrastructure, without which, pretty simply, you end up down swimming with the media, the shareholder activists, the class action lawyers, the litigation funders, regulators and all the other sharks swimming beneath the surface waiting for a compliance breach or an adverse risk event. Fairly poor, I will admit, a fairly poor image, but it does demonstrate how important governance, risk and compliance infrastructure is to an organisation as a protection piece to keep it out of swimming with those sharks, so to speak. So ISO 31000, the international risk standard, look, it is beyond the scope of this webinar to go into great detail, but it's important to understand a key point, that enterprise risk management requires an organisation to follow a clear and structured methodology. And here are the three different elements that make up the ISO 31000 enterprise risk management standard. I'll just run through them all ever so quickly so that we have a background to this. The first one is the set of 11 principles that make up, I guess, I think you should think of these as outcomes in a way to achieve through proper and effective enterprise risk management. The first one is that your enterprise risk management program must create value in the organisation. Now that's a no-brainer. Most boards and most management would agree with that. It really comes down to the implementation as to how that value is created. It must be based on the best available information. We've all heard the garbage in, garbage out analogy and so forth, so we have to have real-time information available at our fingertips in order for key managers and boards to be able to make effective real-time decisions. Again, it needs to push towards that, enabling decision making. Has to be fully integrated with all of the systems within the organisation. In that way, it's not just within systems, within the organisational structures and management structures within an organisation. Risk should be a key part of decision making at all levels. In that way, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be transparent, and information needs to flow both ways. It needs to be built on a structure or a system to be able to bring it to life, and it needs to come off it needs to have linked into it a continuous improvement process, because this is all about an evolving process. It will never, by definition, it will never be perfect. Element 2 is essentially requires a framework. So if we use an analogy of just like you're building a house, you would start with a mandate and commitment, and you would then go to a design, and the design of that house would depend upon what the use and purpose of the house is going to be. Now, a house for your 3 kids in the suburbs will be significantly different to the bachelor pad in the city. It just depends on what you're after as an organisation, and that comes into the design. The implementation is an absolutely critical piece. If you don't plan the implementation properly, you're essentially planning to fail, and a huge part of that comes down to how you're, just like with building a piece of infrastructure or building a house, how you're financing it and what resources you're putting into it over what time frame. That's a critical piece of the framework side of enterprise risk management. Your monitor and review piece is a simple one. It's about maintaining the framework over time. You must build that monitor and review structure into it, and then having that continuous improvement loop that you'll see all the way through this. In terms of the third element, this is the process, and this is the one that most of us on this webinar would have been most familiar with. And this is about going about the day-to-day business of managing risk. And what is it? The ISO 31000 has this particular process, a 7-step process that was essentially an amended process from the old Australian standard. Just to run through this very quickly, the process of risk management starts with engagement, so communicate and consult. It must start at the highest possible place in your organisation, the chairman of the board or the chair of the governors or the council or the head of the committee. It doesn't matter. It has to start at the top. And in this particular area, and like with all things in governance, risk and compliance, the waterfall effect applies. It flows down, not up. This process, as you can see, of engagement and communication and consultation actually steps in at each step in this process. The next stage is to establish the context, and that's about knowing your organisation, knowing where you sit today and where you're heading. So if you haven't got a documented strategy, you can never really understand those key questions like what business are we in and where are we heading and where will we be in 2 years and all of that sort of stuff. The risk assessment process starts with identification of risks. Now, a key part of that is understanding the importance of common risk language to an organisation. And different types of organisations will use different common risk languages. But if you don't have a common risk language that flows through the whole organisation, then different people in different areas or different functions within an organisation will think of risks in different ways. And it's about getting everyone on the same page, so to speak. The risk analysis side is really the central nervous system of enterprise risk management, if I can put it that way. That's where you set your risk appetite effectively and bring that into play through going through each risk identified and assessing and analysing the likelihood and potential consequences of adverse risk events associated with that. With respect to the last three elements, I'll just touch on them quickly. So evaluation, treatment, and then a monitor and review step. The risk evaluation process requires you to assess the control effectiveness in relation to a risk and then make decisions and evaluate whether or not you're prepared to accept the risk as is, or whether or not you need further controls or more effective controls, leading into whether or not you need to put treatments in place. And obviously the monitor and review piece is all about a constant assessment of your evolving risk program. I'll just say one final really important part of the risk management process as you're looking at that diagram. There's no use just doing one step really, really well. This is a 7-step process. It won't work unless you get through to the end of the process and continually and continue to monitor and review. It is an organic tool in that way in an organisation. And just remember that risk management is not about getting to an outcome, because by definition your risk management program or risk will never be perfectly managed in your organisation. Or let me rephrase that, perhaps it will be, but that's if you shut doors and wind yourself up. Now that's not realistic. We must take risk to get reward, whatever those rewards might be in accordance with our objectives. So it's about managing that risk properly. It's about understanding that it is a journey, and it starts with understanding where you're going with your strategy as an organisation. The importance of getting information to and from the board in real time is absolutely critical, and the importance of resourcing all of that is critical as well. It does start with that commitment to the process. And look, the final comment there, stop occasionally and enjoy the view. This is about understanding that really it's an incremental process, and you should actually celebrate the wins every now and then to actually see how well risk is working in your organisation and what benefits you are actually getting from it. Now let's have a look at risk management's bedfellow, compliance. I've got there 3806, so I should have put Australian Standard 3806 next to it. That is the standard on which we certainly build our compliance programs, and I should mention about standards that there are many different standards in these areas, and these might not be the only ones followed. They just happen to be the ones that we tend to follow. Really important to understand the relationship between risk and compliance. This particular diagram, if you look at the black line in the middle, which I'm putting the mouse over at the moment, think of that as the present, the here and now. Risk is a future-looking concept. It's something that looks out into the future and deals with uncertainty. Compliance is, well, I guess in one sense, conceptually, it's a little more black and white. It's a little more cut and dry. And we tend to break compliance down into, I guess, the major categories of legal and regulatory compliance, organisational compliance, and then contracts management. Now, as our risk profile changes, that will also have an effect on the compliance and the nature of the compliance requirements that we have as an organisation, and as our compliance performance changes, that will also have an effect on our risk profile and will change our risk profile. So they are two distinct disciplines, but they're complementary. In one sense, they're different sides of the same coin. Just looking at compliance, when you mention compliance, most people or most managers will think about legal and regulatory, the cut and dry, and the requirement to actually undertake a certain set of tasks as required by law. Now, the reality is compliance is not really about that. It's much bigger than that. Compliance really comes down to the ability of an organisation to achieve its objectives and how you pull all of the moving parts into place to ensure that you do achieve those objectives. So this photo is a quick one, just to use a cycling analogy, of Mark Cavendish winning a stage of the Tour de France. Now, in that particular case, you sit there and say, well, look, he has won that, when the reality is that he's only been able to win that stage through incredible teamwork by an extensive team of people that doesn't just consist of those in his support team on the road with him, on cycles with him, but also consists of all the way as you go back through to, you know, the support vehicles around him, through to his mechanics, through to his physiotherapists and so forth. Now, it's only when all of those moving parts, all of those contributors comply with, work together as a team toward that outcome, that they can achieve that winning outcome. Without that, the outcomes tend to be a little more disastrous for organisations. The compliance standard 3806 is pretty simple. The one thing I will say about reading standards, and I don't know if many on this webinar have read them, but they're incredibly commonsensical documents when you go through them. As you're reading, you'll sit there and you go, yes, yes, that makes sense, incredible amounts of logic and good sense. Now, the people that have sat in behind them to draft those standards have taken a huge amount of time to think through all of those issues. And just as you see here with the compliance program standard, these 12 principles and these 4 different elements of the standard are based on incredibly commonsensical, I guess, inputs, if you like. So from principle 1, starting with commitment, common theme of all standards, all the way through to principle 12, regular review and continual improvement. If you haven't read this standard and you are being tasked in your organisation with building a compliance program, go straight to the standard. It's a great roadmap to use in order to build a standard. To build a program in your organisation. Now we get to the crux of it. How do we actually integrate risk management in your organisation? Look, the backbone of risk and compliance in any organisation is policy management. As simple as that. Policies and procedures are the best enterprise risk management and compliance tools there are. This is an image I grabbed off Google on policy and procedure management, and this touches on some of the school policy management issues. Equally, I could have put a corporate one in there to touch on the different corporate issues that come up around policy management. Now, why is policy management critical? Well, first and foremost, because policies are those key documentary outcomes, if you like, or that control risk in the most simple forms. They enable compliance. They set the why and the how and the who of compliance. When I'm talking about policies for the purposes of this webinar, I'm really using that term to cover policies, procedures and programs generally. Policies also establish accountability, which is absolutely critical for any risk and compliance program to come to life. They protect the assets of an organisation. They protect personal assets. They protect people. That's what they're designed to do. They also enable training of staff. They enable succession planning to come to life in an organisation. They enable you to drive strategic goals and objectives and to set culture. Clearly, culture is one of those areas that is also driven at a range of levels. But if you are going to say that you're a values-based culture, but you can't define that on a piece of paper into a policy, and as to defining what those values are and how they are symbolised in your organisation, well, how on earth are you actually going to be able to live that culture and be able to lead that culture and implement that culture in your organisation? Policies ultimately increase productivity. They enable people to self-serve and self-select to find information and to be able to get on with whatever the job is that they are doing and the task at hand. They also enable a continuous improvement loop to come into play in an organisation. Now, some of the blunders that we see around policy management, and this is a really important one because most of us, when we say policies form the backbone of risk and compliance, will roll our eyes and say, yes, of course they do. Yet, how often do we see policies that are all built into a bulky, all-in-one manual that's distributed via paper and sits on the shelf and is rarely updated and is rarely actually accessed by staff? How often do we see reactive policies that are created? So a pretty typical one from my experience has been where I walk into an organisation and I see a lot of policy gaps but a very, very, very strong termination, discipline and counselling process. And my immediate response to that is, okay, well, you've recently been sued for unfair dismissal, haven't you? To which the manager just sort of nods in the first instance and starts shaking their head at the amount of pain they went through during the proceedings. We also see a lot of cut and paste policy creation. Pretty simple one. Go onto the internet, search a policy on whatever area you see it, you simply insert your organisation's name into that policy. Policies will only work if they're properly tailored and customised for an organisation's needs. It's a no-brainer, that one. We see over-engineered policy approval processes that slow down the process. We see the underestimating of the skill required to actually draft policies. They're not easy to draft. And we also see this concept of siloed policy creation and lack of horizontal integration. It's really important, this one. Basically what it refers to is the fact that in many functional areas in an organisation, policies need to talk or relate to each other. Classic example is EEO anti-discrimination policies, so equal employment opportunity anti-discrimination policies. Those policies are absolutely critical in the HR sphere and in the safety sphere. And often you'll see a policy that sits under your work health and safety policies that's a bullying and violence policy that relates straight back to the EEO anti-discrimination and harassment policy. Yet if we actually separate those two out, one might sit within what we'd call the HR area and the other one in the safety area. If those two policies don't have some linkage or cross-reference to each other, then they're not properly horizontally integrated. And that leaves gaping holes and gaps in our policy management framework and how that works in day-to-day management. Lack of accessibility for staff. Again, we talk about productivity and staff being able to self-service to get access to policies. Lack of ownership of policies. Having an individual or a group owning that particular policy and the updating of that policy for changes in law, for changes in organisational structure and profiles. Not monitoring if policies are being followed effectively. This is a critical implementation step, and we cover that off with our assurance program that enables you to gain assurance to ensure that policies are being properly followed. And the final one is lack of vertical policy integration. And I'll jump over to that just to take you through what that is. Really, if we look at something like a risk management program, what you'll have at the top end of that is a basic risk policy that might even be published on a website setting out a statement of intent to manage risk. You then have the program document that sets out all the basics of how you're going to go about doing it. Beneath that, you're going to have a risk register which gives you the output of that program as you've gone through the risk management process. Now, in order for that to actually come to life, you have to integrate that across your organisational policies with different policies designed as controlling or mitigators to manage specific risks. The next stage is looking at the checklists and processes that you have in place to ensure that you are actually doing what the policies say you're meant to do. I've just put there mobility as a query for everyone, because in this day and age of mobility on different devices, it's becoming more and more of a mandatory requirement for companies to be able to go mobile with checklists so that they can move information around their organisations in real time. The next one is to build in an assurance process, or what we call the wedge, to lock in the capturing of individual tasks driven by policies, the allocation, monitoring and controlling and performance of those tasks. And finally, to build in your incident reporting around all of that to cover off the loop. Another way of looking at that is what we would call our good governance or risk management policy framework. In general terms is this, and that's what we see here as the blue line at the top, your policy management framework, which captures your policies, communicates them, trains and tests individuals on those policies, keeps records of all of that, and has a survey or feedback loop for effectiveness. The grey line we would call the assurance line, which is enabling you to actually, I guess, see whether or not those policies and the specific tasks that come from those policies are being completed. It really enables you to see whether or not your policies are being followed. So you capture tasks, assign them to individuals, monitor the performance of those tasks, control that through escalation, then it enables you to report on that task and ultimately build back a continuous improvement loop on that. And the next question is, how do you do it? And what we really often see is this whole thing around paper chase versus technology. We're still seeing organisations with 3-inch thick policy manuals sitting on shelves, and we're seeing some organisations that are trying to embrace technology without understanding how to actually do that. Most organisations tend to simply throw people at the problem. We as an organisation go down this pathway of organisational content integration. And what really we believe in through implementing things through this process is we fundamentally believe that most organisations have competent, intelligent staff who want to do the right thing. Now, what it is taking those staff and giving them the technology-based tools to enable them to do their jobs in a much more effective way. And that's really the crux of organisational content integration. So let's have a quick look at how that comes to life at an enterprise risk level. Now, for many of you who attended the last webinar that I did, I touched on our CompliSpace fundamentals and assurance applications. And the CompliSpace fundamentals application really takes you through this policy management framework, from policies through to record keeping and the like. The assurance application is a task management application that enables you to test and assess whether or not you're following your policies and procedures. So I'm just going over to a demonstration site of our fundamentals application. You can see here a demonstration or a dummy company called XYZ Corporation, and what you have here is essentially a policy management tool in action. Built like an intranet, smells like an intranet, feels like an intranet. Surprise, surprise, it's a pre-populated intranet that we provide, and we are, for want of a better description, content specialists, and we provide content in these range of content areas, from HR, safety, systems and procedures, an online board portal, and through to specific corporate governance modules themselves. All the content we provide through this policy management tool is customized and tailored for end users. The tool is branded for end user companies, and we keep the content up to date with substantive changes in law and best practice around the specific content modules that are provided. The content, as I said, is provided in modules, so companies can pick and choose the modules that they want to have in place when they feel they need to do that, and the subscription model works in that way. So risk and compliance programs are built within the corporate governance sphere, as are various other governance-related programs. But just to jump into compliance, our compliance program here is built to the Australian standard 3806. Obviously, we go through a customisation process during implementation, but basically it touches on all of the key aspects of what you need to have as built into your compliance program, really pushing down into the compliance operations part of that, which provides, I guess, detailed flesh around the standard that is 3806 that becomes your organisation's way of doing compliance and achieving compliance through all of these steps, all the way down to the continuous improvement loop and communicating with effectively with stakeholders. For each of the different industry groups that we provide this program to, there are a range of different key legal and regulatory compliance issues. This particular demonstration site has a bunch of the specific regulatory compliance issues that tend to apply for financial services companies, for fund managers and for ASX companies. On our not-for-profit demonstration sites we have a lot of key legal and regulatory material in there that apply to those organisations, and the same for schools and the same for general private companies. So the key is customising your policy content to fit your organisation's needs. We follow a similar process with respect to the risk management program, which again is built to the international standard in this case, and it takes you through each of the steps as outlined in that risk management process that I touched on a second ago in the presentation. Now, when it comes to something like a common risk language, we've built in risk classifications that we go through with each organisation and then tailor those to fit that organisation's needs. So using this categorisation methodology or classification methodology with subcategories, here's a simple internal risk subcategory outline of all and common risk language of all of the different risk areas that might apply in an organisation. So the importance of common risk language can't be emphasised enough, and we tend to focus on building in really inclusive definitions around each of these particular sub-classifications. So here's an example on human resources risk, and here are the different areas of human resources risk that you might consider when deciding what risks you might have as an organisation that you ultimately want to build into your risk register and monitor on an ongoing basis. Okay, again, inclusive language, not specifically exclusive. It's so that people in the organisation can all relate to this particular language and use the language accordingly. The other key part of the risk management process, of course, is the analysis, and building out into your analysis your likelihood and consequence matrices and the like. And what we do with all clients is go through the process of building out those matrices and making sure that the specific definitions within those particular matrices work for those organisations. So you can immediately see in here, looking at the different consequences that might apply. Look, death or permanent serious disability for one industry group might, dare I say it, not be considered catastrophic. I doubt they wouldn't consider it that way, but if we take something like underground coal mining, which is a highly dangerous activity, versus financial services funds management might be one where they might take a different view between the two. I'd hesitate to say that any organisation wouldn't have death or permanent disability as a catastrophic outcome, but nevertheless, as we get into some of the more financial outcomes, you'll see they're probably much more quantifiable in nature. So that's about setting your appetite for risk and your tolerance levels around the particular risk. Now, as with all of our fundamentals programs, and you'll note from what I've said about the importance of the general policy management framework, for all of this to properly come to life before you go into the assurance management, you have to ensure that you have trained the relevant staff on all of the relevant issues. So through this policy management tool, you'll find on all of the legally or standard inspired content, we've also built corresponding training programs. So you'll see in the corporate governance sphere training programs around risk, training programs generally around governance, around compliance, and so forth. And these are simple. They're not trying to take you to an accredited level of knowledge. They're simply training the program that your organisation has in place. All pretty simple stuff, all done by individuals, okay, and customised for each organisation at that level. At the end of undertaking a training program, an individual is assigned a test. The tests, again, are fairly simple. They're between 7 and 15 questions long, and the tests really are designed to, I guess, do two things. One is ensure that knowledge has been imparted at a particular point in time, but two, to ensure that the company or the organisation, its officers and managers and directors are able to adequately mount a due diligence defence to show that they've done everything that they should have done in the circumstances to properly implement a particular policy or program. These are all fairly simple. First question is always the same, have you done the training? The last question is always the same, an acknowledgement by the individual. And then we have, as an organisation, a permanent record of the test results. And if I just jump in and show you the result of the risk management test that I did today, you can see straight away the level of detail it gets to, and it's at this point that I hasten to add that this is a demonstration site, so clearly I did know the answer to that question. So you can see the level of detail it gets to in showing you whether or not you need to take remedial action for a particular staff member. It also shows you, as a point of protection for you, the manager, and for the company, a permanent record to show that you've put that staff member through that test and they know what's going on. Now, moving over to the assurance piece, because of course risk management really, as the program comes to life, when you think of that vertical integration process, the program really only comes to life when you actually build into it assurance or task management around that. And it's our assurance tool is built on this particular piece of software called the Ticket on Demand software. This is an Australian-owned and based software provider in this space. Again, the software that we provide to our clients through this is essentially branded and customized for a client's need. Again, we are essentially content specialists, and we provide extraordinary amounts of content through this software to enable risk and compliance to come to life at our clients, in our clients' sites. What you can see from the homepage of this software is that there are a number of different modules or different tools within the software. You have a risk module, you have an incident module, you have a compliance module or a task module as it's called, and then you have an internal audit and reporting module. I'm not going to touch on the internal audit for the purposes of this presentation. I'm going to focus on risk, compliance and incidents specifically. The main thing about good assurance tools or good governance, risk and compliance tools like this is that they make the complex become simple, and that is certainly what the Ticket on Demand product enables you to do. So what we're seeing on the front page is my individual snapshot view of risk and compliance in my particular workplace or in this demonstration workplace. Straight away we can see incidents that have occurred. We can see a heat map of different risks. We can see my favourite reports that I've set up here. We can also see critically a dashboard of different tasks and compliance obligations as to whether they are non-compliant, and we can drill down to see those actual tasks, who has done them, who hasn't done them, why they might not be compliant. If I drill into the risk side of things through the heat map, I've just clicked on really one of the more catastrophic areas, and what you will note there is that the definitions here all relate back to the definitions in our fundamentals program. I'll drill into one of these just by way of example. Here we go, directors and officers due diligence, a work health and safety risk in particular. So let's have a look at how that risk works and the template that sits behind that risk. As we've gone through the process in fundamentals, we've identified the risk. This is where we upload that identified risk to. We might start in Excel and we do a bulk upload of all of those risks when we're first starting this, but on an ongoing basis we then just go straight into the assurance tool to deal with that. What you can see in the task, in the risk template, is the description of the risk. You can see the category, and obviously that category is built to the categorization and sub-categorizations in the risk management program. You can see a plain English description of the actual risk itself and the potential consequences. Importantly, what you can also see is whether or not that risk is linked to a strategic objective of the organisation. In our experience, boards don't tend to talk in the language of risk management, they tend to talk in the language of strategy. So the whole idea of being able to link risks to strategic objectives enables you to report to the board on which risks are going to affect your ability to achieve your strategic objectives. Very, very, very powerful from a reporting perspective. We've also built in a master risk category as well over here, and the master risk category is designed as an alternate category from our more extensive classification structure up here. Again, it's just a way of simplifying from a reporting perspective. We've also built in risk flags, And we see these as critical indicators that enable better reporting from a risk perspective. And they pick up things that flags that cross all types of risks, where I talked about reputation before. So where a risk might have a particular reputational impact or effect, then you can flag that to be able to report that. Same for business continuity and fraud and corruption related risks. We've also built in a board reporting methodology in here that enables you to pick up those risks that you want to report specifically to boards. And I note on that front that one of senior or C-level executive management's biggest quandaries or biggest challenges is what level of granularity of information you should provide through to your board. And in this way, what boards tend to like to see, if they're to see a risk register, is somewhere between, say, 10 and 20 risks in total. If you have more than that, that's too many. If you have less than that, that might be too few. So this enables you to flag those high-level critical, business-critical risks that you want to report up to the board by flagging them as report risks. It also enables you to monitor risks at the level. So they're the risks that might be in the transit lounge, if you like, those risks that senior management wants to monitor trends in as to whether or not you need to escalate that to board reports over time. Now we get down to the assessment of the risk and the analysis. You can see straight away in here your likelihood and consequence matrix, risk owner comments, risk control strategy in long form, and then you can see the residual risk assessment or the control effectiveness assessment that comes out in your residual risk. Now for this particular control, had that been at poor, we might have said that that sits way outside our risk appetite and we actually need to build a treatment in around this risk. So the risk owner is able to actually add a treatment and allocate a task around that. In this particular case, what you're also seeing are the linked tasks or compliance controls that help to mitigate this particular risk. And I'll just drive into directors and officers training to close the loop and show you how that works. Here's the task template that actually shows the controlling task that helps to control that risk. You'll note there's the task name, the task category, again built on that categorization structure that we use for compliance. The plain English description, which is generally a question written in plain English. We tend to focus on plain English because putting too many legislative and regulatory references can often baffle people. We want this to be able to be answered on the run by managers in an organisation, so that then we drill down to the actual allocation of the task. And you can see for the purposes of the demonstration site, this one's been allocated to admin user. You can build that at a business unit level. We tend to always force results when answering a task so that it gets rid of the little white lie. They have to make a comment rather than just saying compliant or non-compliant. And then you can set your task allocation, regularity or frequency. You can also see the escalation points and so forth. Again, at the bottom, we can also see top and tail. You can see the linked risk assessment that was that directors and officers training and verification assessment. We can also see if there are any linked incidents that relate to that particular task. Now going back to the home page, I'll show you what the task looks like when it lands in my inbox. This is essentially a great big database with workflow, so it automatically emails out tasks and risk review and risk actions. And in that particular task, it's set for to hit my inbox tomorrow. And when that hits my inbox in the email, it'll say I have a new task. It'll give me the name of the task and say click here and bump me into the database. Here's my plain English question. It will show me my linked risk assessment if I want to see that assessment. In essence, what I have to do though is go in and say in progress, compliant or non-compliant. Now, if I'm non-compliant, I have to, for any comment I have to provide a comment for any result, and then I'll save that. It might require me to actually add a document to that, but what we can then see is a permanent audit trail of that task completion. The beauty of that is if we ever need to print it out and take that off to a meeting or present that in detailed board reports, we can just throw that straight into PDF. With respect to the incident side of things, this is for picking up your ad hoc incidents that might occur whether they be potential breaches, potential injuries, near misses, or suggested risks that come up. This is designed for all staff to be able to access the incident register to be able to suggest an incident. And the way we do that is linking that back through the main fundamentals policy management tool. So any staff members can simply click here to raise an incident, and it takes them straight over to this page to be able to identify the nature of the incident that they're raising. Sorry, not this page, it's taking them over to the what happened page to identify. And it's through here that you can build in your various checklists and forms, of which we just have a few example or sample forms built in for a staff member to be able to put the information in. I've just clicked on the complaint information. Staff member I can put that complaint, the nature of the complaint and all the detailed material in there and add a document if need be, and then can submit that to the incident manager. The incident manager, whoever that might be in whatever area, and this can be triaged up even more than what you're seeing on the main triage page, can be separated out, I should say, will simply go through the triage list and then give priority to incidents, and it's through the triage page that they can then drill down into the specific incident areas and help to manage those. So if I touch on this Jane Smithers stress claim and we drill into that incident, it's actually a closed claim, a closed incident, but you can see the information that has been put into the form, and you can see that the owner has been able to link risks, to build tasks and add a task to create workflow off the back of that to manage the actual incident itself. And it's that through this particular tool that you can then manage the internal claim or investigation around a particular incident in whatever area. Once again, you can also export that to PDF if need be. Now all of this comes together at the back end through the reporting tool. And the reporting is incredibly powerful through this particular tool. I'll just touch on one particular report quickly to show you an example of that. And really probably a good one is, say, the task risk framework report. And this report actually enables you to start by looking at your various tasks and then link them to the various risks that are in place in your organisation and those risks that those tasks actually control. You can look at that a different way through a risk task framework, which is to look at the risk register and have all your linked tasks that control those risks. It's all very easy to change, and there's a very flexible reporting tool. Here's a very basic task risk framework. You can see the nature of the task, you can see the risk, and you can see the residual risk around that. Okay, very simple stuff. Incredible power in this reporting tool. Incredible power to be able to change fields of information, simply change columns, drag and drop type functionality to build reports out. And we do a lot of work building out different levels of reports and heat maps and things like that. So that in essence is really taking it back to closing off that assurance loop, and that is a way in which to bring risk and compliance to life in an organisation. And you can see through that demonstration that the backbone of all of this is effective policy management built around that fundamentals framework. Just to go back to a couple of final slides on the slideshow to finish off. I guess one of the key final points I would again reiterate that really risk management is simply good management following a structured methodology. The integration of risk and compliance is absolutely critical, and this is all built on the backbone of effective policy management and policy management frameworks and implementation. And ultimately, what does it enable us to do? What are the real benefits in an organisation? Well, I'm sure we've all worked in organisations that have, to varying degrees, experience different aspects of what you see on the screen. Lack of visibility, poor integration, duplication, high cost, fragmentation, etc., etc. The whole idea of this good management concept of enterprise risk and compliance when functioning properly is to tighten all of that up, to bring that integration together, to get rid of the fragmentation and to transform you into something that looks a little more like this. And that is the absolute key to it all. On that note, I will finish. I am about 4 minutes over. My apologies for that. Again, I just emphasise a couple of things. We will make this webinar available in the next 5 days, so we will distribute that to you. If you are interested in finding out more about enterprise risk and compliance and the various governance solutions that CompliSpace provides, we are running several enterprise risk advanced classes in locations around Australia throughout October and November. To find out more, please do visit our website, www.complispace.com.au, and click on the events tab to find out more and come along to those events. We do specialise in delivering tools and services around governance, enterprise risk and compliance, and we'd welcome the opportunity to show you more, and specifically to take you through those for the nature of your specific organisations. Our whole focus is to provide a cost-effective platform that works in application to enable your organisation to get on with doing what it does, but to protect its assets, to leverage its assets and its resources to get the optimum outcomes for you. Look forward to discussing it with you again at some point in the future. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I will be conducting another webinar in a couple of weeks' time. Again, have a look at the events tab, focusing specifically on workplace relations risk management, that is HR and safety, and looking at practical solutions around that. Thank you very much.